Welcome back to the Global Affairs podcast, brought to you by the Indian Review of Global Affairs. I am Akshita Salvekar from SSIS. Today's podcast focuses on the topic of viewing IR through a gendered lens. We are joined by Ms. Aditi Mukund. She is a Symbiosis School of International Studies alumnus who works as a program associate at Cuba9 Initiative. It is a geopolitical advisory based in Mumbai, India. At Cuba9, Aditi helps lead projects on gender mainstreaming in foreign policy. She also runs an initiative, Women in International Relations Network, which seeks to amplify the voices of women in security, foreign policy, and peace building with a focus on Global South. Welcome, Aditi. We would like to begin this discussion with a few informal questions that would help us know our guests better. So, Aditi, I visited your profile on LinkedIn. It said that you are an incidental generalist. While I did look it over and I know it now, I would like you to explain it to our audience of what it means and why do you call yourself that?
Thanks, Akshita, for your question. And also, thank you for having me on this podcast. I'm very happy to be here and I look forward to our discussion ahead. So, you are right about me calling myself an incidental generalist. A generalist is a person with a wide array of knowledge on many different subjects. And this knowledge is not usually very in-depth, but it's really how I sort of view my knowledge of international relations as a whole. I feel like as IR students, we sort of feel the pressure to pick a focus area or to pick a niche very early on in our careers and, in our lines of research. And I really was interested in many different seemingly unconnected things. So that's sort of what a generalist is. It's a bit of a buzzword now. I think it's kind of cool to call yourself a generalist. I don't know. But I also say that I'm an incidental generalist because I wasn't trying to be a generalist. It sort of just happened along the way. So yes, that's what I mean.
That is interesting. So another question for you to sort of know you better. What made you choose this field and what is so appealing about your field?
Right. So by this field, I assume you mean gender and international relations. And very honestly, it's something that I just stumbled into. I really had no intention. I had no plan of really studying or working in gender and international relations. So when I was a student at SSIS, I'm sure you know it. We do a couple of classes on feminist theory in international relations, and that's pretty much what our brush is with the subject. And after that, we don't, of course, consciously apply a gender lens to the subject as a whole, because the subject, as you know, is a very, very diverse field of study. Now, it just so happened that I think I would say a couple of months after I graduated, I was, reading through my dissertation. I don't know why I decided to do that. But my dissertation, amongst other things, focused on the Arab Spring and narratives that emerged after the Arab Spring in Egypt and in Tunisia. And one of the landmark features of the Arab Spring is the mass participation of women in public spaces, right? Like they were on the streets, they were out protesting. And I realized at that point of time that all of the citations and the references that I had listed in my dissertation, barely 30%, I want to say 27% were by women, right? So research papers and, other documents that I had referred to, there was a very stark absence of women authors. And that sort of prompted me to think a little bit more about IR in a very theoretical way. I realized that most IR theorists, by and large, have been men, and the theories that they've put out kind of disregard gender. I mean, they disregard a lot of things, gender being the most obvious thing that's disregarded. And I wanted to do more research about this, and I only later did I realize that there was such a thing as a citation bias, where most people naturally make references to research papers and books authored by men because search engines are tailored towards that. So we're missing a large volume of very valuable literature by women authors. And when I say women, I want to acknowledge that I don't want to look at women as a homogeneous group. There's also racial minorities, ethnic minorities, gender and sexual minorities, and other marginalized groups across the world. So it just so happened that I thought I could do something about it, and that's one of the reasons I started the page that you mentioned in my introduction, the Women in International Relations Network, just as a platform to really amplify the voices of women in international relations and related fields.
Thank you so much. Honestly, your Twitter page is a reference. I use it as a reference. Okay, what is going on? It is my go-to page, personally.
Thank you. Thank you. That's very kind.
So moving on to a slightly formal segment of this podcast, I have some questions for you, Aditi. Why do you think it is important to view international relations from a gendered lens? And what role do women and other gender minorities play in our field?
Right. Thanks for your question. I'd like to think I've sort of addressed some of these topics in my previous answer, right? One being there is a lack of representation of women in this field. We see this in many ways. As I said, we see this through citation biases. But more importantly, I think there is still a disconnect between gender and international relations in a way that most people don't see the interlinkages between these two topics. They view one as maybe a very personal social issue, and they aren't really able to correlate it with international relations as a whole. So I think we need to even go a step back and ask ourselves, what do our personal identities, and this may or may not even be related to gender, what do our personal identities have to do with international relations as a whole? We also need to realize that in a small way or even in a large way, we shape international relations, right? Just because it's a subject we study doesn't mean it is a subject that we don't directly or indirectly participate in. So gender is just one of the many lenses that I think we need to be adding to international relations as a whole. And when I say international relations, I am, of course, including all of the other topics that fit in this very broad rubric of IR as we see it. So if anyone familiar with feminist theory in international relations will know that a lot of feminist scholars, they started out by challenging the absence of women in international relations, in very traditionalist international relations theory and practice. And this absence was visible when it came to women in decision-making positions, and also because they thought that women's lives were not impacted by international relations, or that women did not participate in international relations. Time and time again, based on several different occurrences and incidents in the world, we've seen that traditional IR theory doesn't really sort of rationalize what's going on. We need different ways of thinking to support this traditional thought. So I would say, in a nutshell, because I can really keep talking about this answer, we need to include a gender lens in international relations, because that's one of the ways in which we can make it a very inclusive and participatory process.
So, coming to my area of interest, and I've read it's your area of interest as well, that is foreign policy. Given your experience, how do you think we can make policies more intersectional, especially considering the absence of women in key summits, decision making positions, and even negotiations when it involves their lives is not uncommon? What would be the steps which can be taken, according to you, which can be taken to give more voice to women in this aspect?
Right. I'll try to answer that one by one. To begin with, I think we need to start from a place where we understand the value of having women in international relations. Correct me if I'm wrong, or I'll be happy to pull the exact statistic out for you later. But there is empirical evidence that proves that whenever women are part of negotiating peace agreements, they last longer, up to 60 to 70% longer than when women are not included when negotiating peace treaties or agreements. We've also seen, and this is a very relevant topic, of course, now more than ever, when women negotiate climate change agreements, they take into consideration the people who are most impacted by climate change, marginalized and vulnerable groups across the globe. So we have all of this evidence and we have all of this data. It's about building onto these practices. Second, and I feel like I sort of keep going back to this, but it's important to acknowledge the role that gender really plays in international relations. Only then will we be able to acknowledge why representation matters, why this disparity between men and women is a cause of concern. And speaking of foreign policy, well, the foreign policy making ecosystem is very large, is very diverse. It consists of a lot of processes and a lot of different people and different things. I would say once we've made a case for why the meaningful participation of women is so valuable, we can then go on to take certain steps to ensure that institutionally women don't face any discrimination. Women are put in positions of power where they can really influence decision making.
I actually have a following question to what you said earlier. Looking at conflicts, people often do not realize that women and minorities tend to be the worst affected by conflicts. Could you elaborate on that and on how more awareness can be spread about this?
All right. Let me just maybe take an example that I'm sure everyone's been reading a lot about, the war and conflict that's broken out in Ukraine, right? So a very disturbing statistic is that women and children make up 95% of the entire displaced population. Now, think about it. These women and these children have, lost the sense of normalcy that they used to have. It's proven that women and other vulnerable groups tend to really face the brunt of conflict. We're seeing some really horrific instances of conflict-related sexual violence in Ukraine. So it's not as though this is, this isn't made public. This is publicly available information. It's just not brought to the forefront. And we sort of, again, keep going back to the topic of how women are maybe not considered important enough. They're not viewed as traditional actors in international relations, and therefore their voices, their stories are sort of just pushed to the margins, and then people sort of take the focus away by talking about other things that are going on in this conflict, right? So I think your question sort of answers itself, which is that yes, women are often the worst victims. Women and other minorities are really the worst victims of war-torn situations. So it's may sound like a small step, but a very powerful step would be to acknowledge that and then create policies centering that.
I completely agree with it. I haven't searched for anything gender related, which is why I never came across anything. So I agree with the point that it's not out there and it needs to be. So, coming to my last question, Aditi, what is your opinion of the gender bias during hirings while looking at the IR related jobs? Because we are going to be there soon. So, I would really like to get your opinion on this.
Right. Thanks for your question. In a way, a workspace or any sort of professional environment in the international relations field doesn't really differ from a non-IR field that much, right? So that said, I mean, unfortunately, there are gender biases in every industry, in most industries. Let me put it that way. International relations is no exception. If you don't face a gender bias while hiring, and many don't, that doesn't mean that you might not face gender-based discrimination at work, because it just so happens that most workplaces typically tend to be gender blind instead of being gender responsive. Policies may not be catered towards women or towards minorities or marginalized communities. And more than anything, that gets in the way of women really doing their work, right? Because your policies are sort of preventing women from doing what they've been hired to do. I would also say that, if you look at networking and a lot of these social networks that exist, social and professional networks that exist in international relations, while they did have a tendency to be male dominated, I do see that changing quite a bit. I think that, I do take a lot of inspiration from all the students at SSIS. I see so many of you young people, many young women who are really determined to make their mark in this field. So while I don't want to be pessimistic and say that it's, a horrible world out there, I definitely see scope for change. And that's also something I'm trying to do with the whole Women in International Relations network. So, one of which is creating safe and inclusive spaces for women and those who identify as women.
Hope of change is a positive way forward, I think, right?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Yes. So we have come to the end of this podcast. Thank you so much, Aditi, for speaking to me and for taking out your valuable time. I hope this was a fun interaction, and I'm sure that the audience has taken a lot from this podcast, from your experience in the field.
Thanks so much, Akshata, for having me. This has been a very fun interaction, and I was really glad to be a part of it. And side note, I used to host the IRGA podcasts when I was a student at SSIS. So really being on the other side of the other side of the mic has been like a full circle experience for me. So thank you, and thank you to your entire team as well.
Thank you so much, Aditi, for talking to us. And thank you, listeners, for your time. I hope this podcast gave you something new to ponder upon about international relations. Check out Women in International Relations Network by Aditi on Twitter. There's always something new to catch up there. So that was Ms. Aditi Mukund from Benign Initiative giving her valuable insight on the topic of international relations through gendered lens. Thank you all our listeners, and do tune in on our next episode.